Juan Agibay Molina. He's an LLM graduate from McGill Law School, so right here, he's in his home turf. And he's going to be talking about trade mispricing in Argentina as a case study. The discussant is Professor Buchanan from George Washington University Law School. And if we're describing his paper. Well, great, I'm here. So maybe take another minute to collect your thoughts.
Technical problems?
Technical problems, yes.
Oh, one doesn't need a PowerPoint. You don't need a PowerPoint. This is my student, so I can say that to him. You don't need a PowerPoint.
I don't need it.
It's on my ear off without a PowerPoint.
Something about PowerPoint.
What's that? Nothing.
Well, good afternoon. Before starting with my presentation and solving this issue, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Alison Christians, who was my supervisor during my thesis, for inviting me to this unique event. I'm also grateful to McGill, and in a broader sense to Quebec and Canada for hosting me during the LLM, and now for making my trip from Argentina possible. It's a pleasure and a great honor to speak about trade mispricing, from now on TM, and to discuss with you some questions that I asked in my thesis. Usually, TM is defined as the deliberate over-invoicing of imports . Sorry for that. Well, as I was saying, TM is defined as a deliberate over-invoicing of imports or under-invoicing of exports, generally for illegal ends, such as tax evasion, capital flight, fraud, etc. Well, my thesis evaluates this phenomenon from a criminal law perspective. I am not a tax lawyer. In particular, my research explores these business transactions as performed within the exchange of goods and services. And my main contribution, I believe, is whether TM is a plausible phenomenon. I mean, understand if this is a phenomenon that has been legally categorized correctly by the legal academia, and consequently to think about a different approach to propose a solution to this problem. However, as soon as I started with my research, many more questions were triggered. Does trade enhance welfare? Does how business is done matters? Is the state a necessary part in any commercial transaction? Are we compelled to behave truthfully or honestly when we trade? I would like to start with one example, because I think that it will be helpful to convey the essentials of my presentation that I don't have. You know that the world's most important football derby is between two teams from the Spanish league, Real Madrid and Barcelona. Both teams are very competitive, and the competition exceeds the game. If one of them hires a star, the other one will hire the sun. I mean, they really compete between each other. And during 2010-2012, they were trying to hire a Brazilian child who was not available on the market because he was too young. I'm talking about Neymar. You might know him. He's also known as the second best after Lionel Messi. In 2013, Real Madrid did an alternative move. So they hired a Scottish player that is called Gareth Bale, who was playing in the UK. The transaction worth more than 100 million. Barcelona, on the other hand, they unexpectedly hired Neymar. Here is the Argentinian touch on this story. There is always one. The coach of Barcelona, Gerardo Martino, publicly stated that paying that amount of money for bail was not moral. So the answer didn't wait to arrive, and Real Madrid asked Martino if he was aware about the real cost of the transfer of Neymar. So when I was writing my thesis during the summer of 2013 here at the library, I knew about this story. There was not much information available at that moment, but the gross figures allowed me to think that something obscure was happening. At that time, I said that the vice president of Barcelona announced a transfer that cost 57 million euros. But surprisingly, the Brazilian board of the Football Association informed the public that they only received 17, and that 8 were to be paid to 2 corporations that own part of the rights of the football player. So I will stop with this amazing story now, so that I can introduce the first idea that I want to articulate from this case. Neymar's story invited me to think that this phenomenon was plausible. Invited me to think about the discrepancy regarding the real price of commercial transactions and what is later stated on the documents on contracts that support each transaction. So I use this theoretical framework that provides Professor McGill from Wisconsin University to understand things from the bottom up, to start from these issues and to try to build a theory from them. So, as he said, Professor McGill, quote, says, the goal of this approach is not to produce certain fixed truths about human society. Rather, it will seek to understand the present and to anticipate the future with a greater probability of accuracy, understanding that our knowledge can only be tentative. I was going to show you that I submitted my thesis by August 2013, and during January and February of 2014, not only the president of Barcelona needed to resign due to this case, but Barcelona needed to pay that near 20 million euros that were owed to the tax authorities in Spain due to this transaction. Said that, generally, the information available regarding commercial transactions for the authorities and for the public is incomplete. So when I was trying to start my research, I was facing a huge problem. So the dichotomy arises when what is reported about the business transaction and what it's really happened, it's different. And the gap between reported business transactions and real business transactions allow to recall what Professor McCauley claims as law in action. And he said, quote, often the best we can offer is a provisional and qualified picture of the world as our best guess of what others would find if they look at what we are examining. Business in the real world do not conclude what contracts or documents supporting business allocate. There is a bigger sphere, a shadow that needs to be explored. So, due to this lack of information, what I tried to do to deal with this lack of information was to imagine some hypothetical scenarios where these issues of trade mispricing could be plausible, to demonstrate that these are real, actual problems in business transactions. So I thought about my country, Argentina, that we export most of the things that we grow and produce, and I paired it with a US corporation. So I thought about A and B as two corporations that had a legitimate business. So both are registered, both are authorized to export and import at the same time. So those kind of transactions in countries as Argentina and perhaps Venezuela and some more are subject to various taxes. For the sake of this argument, I thought about the income tax and also the export tax that we have those. We have tariffs on all the export transactions that we do, and depending on each commodity, it varies the rate of the tax. So that's a great incentive for exporters to play with prices in any commercial transaction. Just to give you two examples, I thought about a transaction of pears, selling a container of pears from A to B, and that would be taxed at a 5% rate on the FOB price. But for soybeans, that is the one that really matters for the economy of my country, it can get until 45%. So a legitimate transaction would have the same price agreed and the same price in the commercial invoice and the same price transferred from each accounts of each society. So I thought the first example of a mispriced transaction would be when the parties agree to purchase one container for a price, let's say $20,000, and it would be better to deposit one part of the payment in a foreign account. So instead of issuing an invoice for the total amount agreed, A would issue an invoice for a reduction of the price of, let's say, 25%, and B would send the outstanding balance to a foreign account, let's say for us, Uruguay or Panama, that are the tax havens most usually used. When the deal is agreed upon, the parties would perform the contract to meet their commitment. The goods would be available in their facilities, the goods would be taken to the port or shipped according to the transportation agreement. So C, it's a new incorporation, owns the account where B transfers the balance. C is a shell corporation established in a tax haven, and as such has no commercial operation or assets. Probably certain directors or employees of A created C in order to disguise the real estate holders. Neither C nor C's account in the tax haven are declared to the authorities in Argentina. So when I was thinking in this example, I thought that it was not the only way to misrepresent a transaction. Also, the transportation is subject to mispricing. This is a little bit more complicated, and now it would be really problematic not having my presentation to show you, but I will try to do it in my own words, so to be clear.
You can use the chalk and use the chalkboard.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
So we have A and B, and we have the commercial transaction. When we need to deal with transportation, that is the second problem, A needs to deal with E, with the carrier. The carrier are always corporations that multinationals that has built up leverage. So A would find A2, A3, and A4, and they would build up leverage, grouping their claims to negotiate volume contracts and freight rates. So D, in order to deal with E, would use an intermediary. Would be usually the intermediaries are, let's say, in Netherlands or in any other tax haven, and what they do is to receive the payment for the transportation, and then to reallocate that spread into C, C1, or C2, that they are all related with A. So I thought about this hypothetical scenario to show you that this can be a plausible phenomenon, but then I tried to figure out what was the legal consequences about this. How much time do you have?
2 minutes.
So the first thing that I thought was, well, A and E are surely knowing what is happening. B could be aware or don't care, but could also be part of the scheme if he's not aware, because usually F what would do is to mark up the prices and stating something higher than the real price. So he can have a spread that then can be shared with C1 and C2. So when I was thinking about these hypothetical scenarios, I was thinking that depending on where you stand, you can see how big the problem is. If they are agreeing on FOB prices, so B will be the one paying for the freight, it's usually on commodities that A would offer B the freight rates, and B would accept them. B would be happy to pay what A is telling him. So if B is paying F, F will pay E, and F then will send the spread to C1, C2, and C3. 1 minute, sir. But this could work on the other way around. If they are working on CFI or CFR conditions, so the cost and freight is paid by the exporter, this could be a means to shift money abroad, to reduce the tax burden in Argentina, and by doing this, he could not be part of this scheme. So I know that this would be better with my presentation, but let me say that to conclude, I will conclude with this, believe me. I believe that we need to acknowledge that this kind of academic events, today's conversation, takes place in a context of extreme economic inequality, which affects deeply to developing countries. So I take this opportunity to make a humble argument in favor of this, the academic cooperation, to have more these kind of conversations. Only through increasing quality and quantity of education on developing countries, we will be able to understand issues as trade mispricing seriously and eventually to approach a solution. I truly believe that whether we want to change the world, we need to start working on that direction. And sharing knowledge is one step. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Buchanan.
Thank you. That was a very interesting and important presentation. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge and thank Allison for having me here. I could gush, but I only have a few minutes, so I'll move on. Especially because I wanted to clarify one important point, and I'll admit this is just off topic, but I can't resist, about the Thomas Piketty work that was brought up in a previous session. This is the thing that has bothered me, has begun to bother me about the discussion. The book that Piketty is now famous for could be completely wrong. I'm not saying that there's any probability. I'm saying there is the possibility that it could be completely wrong, but even if it were completely wrong, it wouldn't change anything about what we know about tax justice, right? In other words, Professor Cohen pointed out that the book says that we are becoming, moving in the direction of patrimonial capitalism. Even if that's false, other work tells us that we know that we could have 75 to 80% marginal tax rates on high income, funding the things that would enhance human rights domestically and internationally, and we would still not destroy capitalism, which is, of course, what the red baiting does on Piketty. I just had to make that point because it would be a shame if the famous book became the argument for redistributive taxation. It's just not. Okay, so that might tell you that I'm an economist. And I am sort of, I'm a recovering economist. When I was an undergraduate, I wanted to study international economics. And one of my professors said, don't study international economics, it's a mess. And I said, well, what do you mean it's a mess? And he said, well, to start with, all the data are terrible, right? And I said, well, what do you mean all the data are terrible? There's numbers out there. I've seen, statistical books from, the World Bank. And he said, yeah, but the data is terrible. I mean, it's just unreliable data. And so when I got to graduate school, I considered it, and I went to the first day of international economics as a field, and I lasted about an hour before I went screaming into the night. And what it turned out is that the data are so bad that the field became theory obsessed, right? If you can't rely on your data, then it just became even more crazy. And so Juan's work here is important in that, because what he's describing is that it's not just bad data collection systems, right? That what's happening is data collection that is driven by self-interested lying, okay? So when he talks about trade mispricing, he's talking about fraud. Right? And as I read his thesis and as I listened to his discussion, the thing that, and this is true whenever you have emerging scholars working on theses, you say, okay, so you've got something interesting, that's a good start. Where does this go? Because I'm sitting there thinking, one of the questions that he asks is, should the trade mispricing even be within the purview of criminal law? And my answer is, well, why the hell not? It's fraud, right? This is just keeping two sets of books, right? He gives examples. He talks about Neymar, right? Which some people call a football player. Just a different game. What do you have there? I mean, this is just a classic example of the different parties doing their own self-interested thing, right? The payer over-reports how much he paid, right? Because that makes his taxes go down. The payee underreports what he received because that makes his taxes go down, right? So I'm reading this and I'm saying, that happened in the Neymar situation. It happened with an example that he gives of China and Norway. The Zambia example that didn't come up in the presentation, but shows up at the beginning of the thesis, is an interesting one because it's not clear why Zambia was willing to put up with something like an 83% underpayment. It sounded not like an underreport, but an actual underpayment. So I've already hit my time limit, so I'll finish with this. What will make this work move forward is not asking the question, is this prosecutable as fraud, but I think instead asking the question, given that it's obviously of a category of fraud, what new and interesting things are there to say about it? And I think there are many new and interesting things to say, but I'm going to have to share them in a private email with Juan and not with the rest of you.